The next panel is really the working panel. After we've heard all of these great comments and work that's been done by people, now it's about how do we ensure the civil rights. And so we've invited two leaders, one from the ACLU, and his name is Mohammed Tajsar. Mohammed is senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California. He joined the organization in 2017. Mohammed's work primarily focuses on national security and counterterrorism policy, with an emphasis on Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. Mohammed's current docket includes Fazaga versus FBI. That's the famous FBI informant who went into the mosque calling on people violently. And so the mosque reported him to the FBI later to find out he was actually working for the FBI. And then prior to joining the ACLU, he was working in a law firm focusing on civil rights and workers' rights. He's also been a began his legal career as a law clerk in U.S. District Court for District of Nevada and a legal fellow for the ACLU. He's a graduate of UC Berkeley School of Law and from UCLA. Dina Chahada. Dina is the civil rights managing attorney for CAIR-LA. Dina specializes in direct legal services to American Muslims facing religious discrimination in a vast array of matters, including employment, travel, education, interaction with law enforcement and the FBI, public accommodations in prisons, as well as advocating for victims of hate crimes and hate incidents. Prior to joining CAIR-LA, Dina worked as a litigation attorney for 7 years in both civil and administrative courts. She is licensed to practice law in the state of California. She graduated also from UCLA and attended Georgetown University Law Center, obtaining her Juris Doctorate degree. Also, Dina happened to be an MPAC intern, and she wrote a paper about women's rights in Islam that was the topic of a briefing in the State Department. So we're very proud of her work and very proud to have Dina with us today at the Islamic Center. So we're just going to engage in conversation. Obviously, we've heard very compelling testimony. You've probably already heard it from these students, from these activists, in terms of what's facing our community. So can you tell us a little bit about what your focus is on protecting our students and protecting our community as we deal with an issue that, quite frankly, has been going on for, I would say, 60 years. The intimidation, the silencing. There's a great book by a former congressman called "They Dare to Speak Out," that outlines people who, from the 50s and 60s, were targeted by AIPAC, by other pro-Israel groups, and they lost their jobs. So this is now happening again, but it seems like it's a little different. So I just wanted to get your general thoughts on where we are today. We could start with Dina.
This one? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon all of you. I think that one of the biggest threats we are seeing today with respect to freedom of speech and what's happening on universities and college campuses is the very concerted effort to criminalize free speech. So we saw this directly after October 7th. We saw it in Florida when they tried to shut down all of the Students for Justice for Palestine chapters. The ACLU worked with Palestine Legal to make sure that that didn't happen. We saw that shortly after that with the Anti-Defamation League and the Brandeis Center when they tried to say that we should start criminalizing Students for Justice in Palestine and really anyone who is speaking out in support of Palestine under the guise of material support for terrorism. And we have seen that in a very targeted way when you saw these really brave students here that were speaking, and we saw that the response to their activism has been to criminalize the activism in indirect ways, to blame them for violence that they are not responsible for. We are seeing them targeted not just criminally, but also in their universities with student discipline procedures that really have robbed them of due process rights. So what we've been seeing on university campuses generally students should be given the right to notice about violations that they've committed, a right to conversation. We're just seeing suspensions happen straight away without any due process. So that's something that's happening across college campuses. And then we're seeing, of course, maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we're seeing legislation that's very dangerous. And we're seeing some of the worst weaponization of anti-Semitism. People really need to understand that Zionism in the fascist way that it is existing today, especially in this country, is a threat not just to Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims, but is also a threat to Jewish Americans. And the weaponization of anti-Semitism that we are seeing codified in our laws and our legal system is really, really terrifying. And so before I pass it over to Muhammad, just to give you an idea, something that my organization does, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is we track bias incidents and hate crimes and bias incidents that happens on college campuses. And I can tell you that as we are tracking this data from October 7th to the end of June, just before this month, and if you compare that to the same period the year prior, we are finding that bias incidents against Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, and others in our community who are allies to the Muslim, Arab, Palestinian communities. That includes Jewish allies, that includes, our brave Latino ally that was here earlier. Those bias incidents have more than doubled. When you look at hate crimes and hate incidents, we have seen a staggering 642% increase in hate crimes and hate incidents that these communities are experiencing. And then worst of all, one of the highest increases that we are seeing is that on campuses of higher education, we have seen over a 1,650% increase. That is a staggering percentage that should really terrify all of us.
Thank you, Dina. That is terrifying. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mohammed. As Salam said, I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California. We are a civil rights organization, primarily legal, but not exclusively. And we focus on vindicating individuals' rights that are laid out in the U.S. Constitution, among other places. So I'll just briefly say, I think the problems have been outlined really, I think, succinctly and powerfully by Dina and others before me. I'll just briefly mention a few things that the ACLU has done, and then kind of turn it over to you, Salam, and we can talk about sort of details and other things. But just I want to make sort of two points. I'll describe a little bit about what we have done, but before I do that, I should say that one thing that is, I think, an additional cause for hope is that the beyond the movement itself among students and others to engage in the form of protest that they have been engaged in, that itself is in some a cause for hope, particularly for those who view sort of freedom for Palestinians as a righteous endeavor. It is also a cause for hope to see the amount of support and help among civil society for these movements from across the kind of American domestic kind of civil apparatus, from organizations like the ACLU and others who are nonpartisan, who take no position on what's going on in Palestine, but who take exception to the attacks on free speech that we have seen in this country since October 7th. And we at the ACLU are really, I think, a small part within this big map of sort of institutional support from places like MPAC, CAIR, the ACLU, lots of other organizations, First Amendment organizations, sort of interfaith organizations, a whole bunch. And I've seen that kind of daily, actually, because I'm in conversations with these folks, people who don't really care two hoots about Palestine, but who are really agitated about what they've seen sort of outside in the public. So I think that's important. For our part, we, at least with respect to the specifics of like what's been going on locally on university campuses, we've tried to engage a little bit, and I hope we'll continue to engage on this question. We've sort of issued statements and letters to USC, UCLA, UCI, and all these organizations really, all these universities really taking issue with their approach and their sort of really vindictive kind of punishment of student speech. We kind of blasted USC's decision to not allow its valedictorian to speak in its graduation. We have lamented UCLA's sort of capitulation to violence as a justification for ending its encampments. We've sort of put out public statements to this effect. We've also attempted to sort of kind of provide basic legal advice to some students who are involved in this sort of in this movement to sort of assure people of like what their rights are, what they can and can't do, you know, where the lines between protected forms of speech and civil disobedience is. I think that's a really important line, something that lawyers can provide some assistance on. Like, here's what you can do legally. Here's what you can't do legally. You'll be punished for it. You may decide to do it anyway because that's your prerogative, but you should know that you may get punished for it. So providing that sort of technical legal advice is something that we've been doing. We've also represented some students themselves in various proceedings. We represented two individuals who are legal observers who were arrested on May 9th at UCLA, individuals who were there not as protesters, but there to kind of document and see what is making sure that there's no kind of repression of students' sort of speech. Those individuals were arrested by the university campus. So the university didn't just arrest the students, it arrested journalists and those who were observing the students for reasons that are unknown. We represented those individuals, successfully got them their property back when the university seized them. We've also, thanks. We also have represented a number of individuals and are trying to represent individuals in these disciplinary proceedings within the university system. Basically, once the university arrested them, they've now placed them in academic disciplinary proceedings that, as folks described earlier, causes them not to be able to register for classes, withholds graduation privileges, forces them not to be able to walk, in graduation ceremonies. So we've done some kind of work on that front. We also have advocated against the release of the names of arrested students. This is something that happens at UCLA and other places where the universities publish or make available publicly the names of all the individuals that it has arrested as part of its encampment, under the guise of responding to public record, under the guise of making public records available. But we've tried to get them not to do that because it's uniquely sort of dangerous to list the names of individuals who are arrested in these encampment clearings, because we fear retaliation both from the university side, but also from private individuals, employers, and the like. And then lastly, we're in the middle of investigating kind of further all of the sort of legal violations that we believe have taken place in places like UCLA and UCI. So there's a number of things that we've been doing, and my hope is that our small contribution in conjunction with the contributions of many other organizations in civil society, will help ensure that students, at least in the fall, have a place where they can really express themselves without fear of repression from the university.
The first question, and go ahead and start writing your questions, but we already have a couple of questions about the land sale event at the synagogue. And primarily the question is, isn't that a discrimination of American law to sell land, aside from the fact that you're selling stolen land abroad? That's one matter. But isn't there American law that opposes any kind of discriminatory land sales that is only for a particular religious group and taking it from a particular group as well? And by the way, there has been a lawsuit by the Zionist side against the Palestine youth movement. If you can speak to that as well.
Yeah, I could speak just on the latter. On the former, I'm not an expert in this area of law on the question of whether it is a violation of U.S. prohibitions on discriminatory sort of sales and redlining and all the rest of it. I'm not an expert there. I assume that question depends in part on whether the well, let me step back. There is a long history in the United States, as you all probably know, of racist housing laws that prevent individuals from, primarily Black people, from owning land in particular areas within the United States to ensure that they are segregated. And those rules, in theory, were prohibited in a series of decisions and kind of legislative enactments beginning in the 1940s and 50s through the 1960s, so that it's now prohibited for a private individual to say, I will only sell my house to a white person. You can't do that. The question of whether those laws prohibit the same kinds of sales abroad, that I don't know the answer to. I'm sure other more sophisticated lawyers than I would know the answer to that question. I think that on the note about the lawsuit, though, there was, as Salam said, an attempt to sue the organizers of the protest for protesting, again, making claims about sort of anti-Semitism and all the rest of it. That actually seems pretty clear to me to itself be a form of repression of First Amendment rights, actually. And there are mechanisms within the U.S. legal system to prevent the use of litigation as a weapon to silence individuals' speech rights. In particular, there is a state law. It's called it's referred to as the anti-SLAPP law. Anti-SLAPP stands for the Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. That is, that if you engage in strategic litigation against public participation, that is to say litigation that's designed to force you to not engage publicly, that is your right. Litigation that's designed to suppress your First Amendment rights. If you are subject to a lawsuit like that, you can go into court and say, hey, I'm the defendant in this lawsuit. All they're complaining about is me doing what I am allowed to do under the Constitution. That defense enables you to a series of kind of summary legal proceedings that can actually turn out quite poorly for those who have instigated the litigation. And so it seems to me that lawsuit, again, as having only sort of briefly reviewed it, is an attempt to silence individuals for First Amendment protected activity in ways that I think will subject the plaintiffs in that case to serious legal consequences. So those are kind of two things, two notes about that question.
Yeah, so in addition to what Mohammed said, there are definitely laws in our country. We know, like in the state of California, there's the Fair Employment and Housing Act, and there are federal laws that mirror FEHA, as it's the short way to say it, that prohibit any organization or individual from selling or renting or leasing to one specific race, national origin. There's a lot of protected characteristics that you can't discriminate against. So in that aspect, I do think that there may be some grounds upon which to oppose the events that are happening. I know our organization is looking into potentially launching some legal challenges to that type of activity that's been taking place, not just here, but you may have heard that, it's the same real estate company that, this Israeli real estate company that has been launching these same kinds of events also on the East Coast, in New York and New Jersey. I think another thing to keep in mind is although, there are additional international laws that this type of sales event may be violating, that in the United States, we are signatories to a lot of international conventions that prohibit this type of illegal sale of land that is stolen. And so, at least in the United States, I think you can work to hold people accountable for violating our responsibilities under those types of international laws and conventions as well.
Can I just add one quick thing? Just to put a finer point on why this is such a problem. If I recall correctly, Islam, you would know this, but the event that kicked off these protests described the sales of property in Anglo communities. Far apart from like any kind of legal consequences, it is quite an extraordinary thing to see a flyer in 2024 that advertises the sale of property in Anglo communities. I mean, this is the stuff of 1930. This is not the stuff of 2024. And I think that by itself, far apart from whether we should have any, we should think of legal strategies, we should be, I think, quite shocked.
Maybe less aware of the laws that guarantee them the right to protest. When they see the police come, they see this militia that Omar is talking about, intimidating, threatening them, other individuals ready to instigate altercations. How does the ACLU defend the right of people to protest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most important thing that not the ACLU, honestly, it's places like CAIR and others, they have come, organizations have created sort of intake lines, right? Dina, you can talk a little bit about that, but there are scores of lawyers, both private, sort of private lawyers at organizations like ours, who are standing ready to defend the rights of individuals who are subjected to these kinds of things. And the way that, and that organizations like CAIR, Dina, you might be able to speak to this, are playing the role of like connecting lawyers with these individuals who have been subjected to these kinds of things. And that's how like organizations like mine get a chance to step in and provide basic legal services to these orgs.
Can you add anything to that, Lee? Okay, good. By the way, we will pray Dhuhr, inshallah, in about 10 minutes. So those of you who are getting fidgety, don't worry. We will have Dhuhr prayer. On the issue of, back to the issue that I believe Dina brought up, and this is another major issue, this initiative to designate pro-Palestinian student groups, I think namely Students for Justice in Palestine, for quote-unquote material support of a foreign terrorist organization. If you have material support for a domestic terrorist organization, you're protected by the Constitution. The FBI cannot investigate you, conduct surveillance, freeze your assets, do any of that stuff. They told us specifically, because when we complain about these quote-unquote domestic, which is not really domestic, it's transnational, but that's another discussion, they said, well, we have to wait for them to commit a crime. But if you are being accused of supporting a foreign terrorist organization, then all the post-9/11 national security apparatus can be unleashed against you, which is obviously dangerous. And here we go again. So if you could speak to that, how we're pushing back, I know CAIR is doing a lot, ACLU, pushing back against this legislation and or this policy by the FBI and the Department of Justice and all the other national security apparatus of this country. All in 2 minutes.
I almost feel like Mohammed should answer this because the ACLU did write a really strong letter when the ADL and the Lewis Brandeis Center came out and said, all these SJP students, they should be arrested. They're basically providing material support to foreign terrorist organizations. There is a federal law that criminalizes that kind of conduct, but there are specific parameters to that where you have to be acting at the behest of or in coordination with the terrorist organization. So even if I come out and say today, I fully support X terrorist or what's been designated by the United States as a terrorist organization, as we know, the US designations are not always just, and they are very strongly motivated by a lot of interests that are not just in the service of justice. But even if I were to say that as an opinion, that is not enough to run afoul of that federal prohibition. And so I think the efforts, basically, these Zionist entities are doing everything they can to criminalize pro-Palestinian speech and activism. I want to turn it over to Mohammed because his organization wrote that letter.
Yeah, just a couple things. So maybe quickly, just a quick legal primer, because I think this is somewhat important, because the question always becomes like, can I say, we get this question, like, what if I go out and like on the public street and say I support Hamas, or like I go and support, I say I support the military junta in Myanmar or something, whatever. Can I get punished for that? Like, is that okay? So just a couple things real quick, because I think this is important. So in general, right? Everyone has a free speech rights under the Constitution to say whatever it is that you want to say, subject to some very limited exceptions. Most relevant here, there is an exception about imminent violence. So in general, whatever you say is protected by the First Amendment unless what you say intends to produce imminent lawless action and it is likely to do so. Okay, imminent lawless action and it's likely to do so, right? That's from a famous Supreme Court case called Brandenburg. So unless you're imminent, like where you're about to say, like, let's go kill Salam or something right now, and you're standing here, there's like a mob, and you're about to go do it.
People ideas.
Yeah, or whatever. That's what we're gonna do. Then that might be a problem. Whatever. And so you're gonna say that. Unless you're doing that, if you go out and say, I hate MPAC or like I hate the ACLU and they're awful and everyone should, do whatever, like that in general should be that's okay. Now, in theory, what that means is if you go out and say Hamas is great or like the MEK, like the Mujahideen are okay or whatever, or some other designated terrorist organization are okay, the FARC, then you, in theory, should be protected. But as Salam said, that's not how it works in the foreign context. There is a foreign law. It's called the Material Support Statute. It's at 18 U.S. Code 2339B, if you're interested. And what that says is that law prohibits the provision of, quote, material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. So then the question is, it specifically says whoever knowingly provides material support or resources to a foreign terrorist organization or attempts or conspires to do so shall be fined under this title for not more than 20 years or both and blah, 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 blah. So it says all these things. So then you might ask, okay, well, what's material support? Like, what does that actually mean? And material support is defined quite broadly. And this is why it's very controversial. It includes the provision of property, tangible and intangible, service, training, expert advice, personnel, explosives, all kinds of things. So there are a couple of really big sort of words in there, including training and personnel. Like, what does the provision of personnel to a foreign terrorist organization mean? This law engendered lots of litigation because lawyers, in part, were like, well, what if I counsel a foreign terrorist organization or help them negotiate to, release hostages or provide legal advice about peace negotiations or diplomacy or whatever? Am I guilty of material support? And the Supreme Court said, can I be guilty of material support? But if I'm just like speaking. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called the Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, said that yes, you can be, unless you're acting, this is what Dina said, totally independently of the organization. That is, if you're acting under the concert or under the control or guidance of the organization, then you can be guilty of material support. But if you're acting independently, without any connection to that organization, then you are protected by the First Amendment. So what does that mean in practical terms for students or anybody else? That means that unless Hamas told them to go out and say X, Y, and Z, that in theory, what they say is protected by the First Amendment, and that you can go out on the public street and say, I support Hamas. Whether or not I'm not going to take a position on whether you should say or not say that. Just know that the designation of foreign terrorism by itself is not enough to criminalize speech in support of it. That you can speak in support of that organization if you are acting independently of that organization.
Yeah, and on top of that, there's a lot wrong with our national security policy. Number one, it's not making us secure. It's creating more anti-American sentiment throughout the world. It is reducing U.S. credibility. So if these guys in the National Security Council are saying that this is supporting national security, I think we should just call, the emperor has no clothes there. It is hurting our national security. When you look at the list of foreign terrorist organizations that the U.S. State Department issues, 90% are Muslim. In other words, there's no Hindu terrorist organization that is designated. There's no Jewish Zionist terrorist organization that is designated. There's no white supremacist transnational group on that list. So to single out one group primarily as having the terrorist problem, and then they come and pat you on the back and say, oh, we're going to try to help you reduce Islamophobia. Islamophobia is starting from the policy itself. And that's what we have to fight That's the root cause of Islamophobia. The other issue, and I'm really sorry because we could spend hours talking, and maybe we could do that over coffee at some point. The anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism legislation, movement, whatever. We had the city attorney here. They're being lobbied heavily. The mayor, and the city council and the city attorney to use, I forgot the IHRA rule on anti-Semitism that basically is defined by actions against Israel, not actions against Jews as a people. So if you could just tell us a little bit about what you're doing on that and safeguarding our community on that issue.
Sure. Yeah. So what that definition does is it essentially expands the definition of anti-Semitism to where it is not just discrimination against people of a certain faith, but it also includes like national origin and race. And so they want to expand the definition of anti-Semitism to essentially include any criticism of Israel or Israelis or the Israeli government. And that's really problematic. Some of the things that we're seeing here, for example, I don't know if you all are aware, but in California, there's California Senate Bill 1287, which they tried passing in public post-secondary institutions of education, meaning colleges and universities, that had a lot of really wonderful language about adopting policies that prohibited interference with free exercise of our constitutional rights. But what was tucked into the language was that it would also prohibit speech that calls for and supports genocide. How do you construe what kind of speech would call for and support genocide? And it would require, as a condition of admission and continued matriculation at that institution, that people sign almost like an oath or an agreement as a condition of their admission to acknowledge their obligation to comply with that section. Now, based on what Advocacy our organizations are doing, I believe the ACLU spoke at some of those hearings, so did CAIR. They actually have revised the language of that bill to remove the prohibition on speech that calls for or supports genocide. We also saw recently that the House of Representatives passed legislation called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that, as Salam was saying, adopts that definition. I think that's still currently waiting for approval from the Senate, if I'm not mistaken. But it is a really big problem that we see that there's a conflation happening between Judaism and Israel. And that's a conflation that should be rejected and is rejected, we should note, by a lot of really wonderful Jewish organizations who say, not in our name, and who say that we are not, this Judaism cannot be conflated with Israel or Zionism. And so I think that, advocacy that organizations like ours do is really important, but advocacy that any of you can do, that I do, to take 5 minutes or 10 minutes of your day or your week or your month to call your elected officials and representatives to write in and call in and go to your, local city council meetings and say that we oppose this weaponization of anti-Semitism, that we oppose the conflation of these terms, that they are separate, and to call for accountability for our elected officials. If you noticed in the picture that Omar had up, you didn't see Jewish Voice for Peace there. You didn't see If Not Now there. You didn't see Jewish Americans who are actually anti-genocide, and there's a reason for that. And I think that that's an agenda that needs to be really explicitly taken on.
I think the last words from you both: protect our students, through civil rights law. How can people be involved in this endeavor to protect the First Amendment at this time? Because we feel like it is seriously under threat. So if you could just close on words of wisdom on how we can approach that problem.
Boy, it is a fool's errand to come to me for wisdom. So I think I think there are a couple of things. So certainly in terms of staying connected to organizations like CAIR and the ACLU, you should consider becoming members of both these organizations. You can help pay for my salary. I don't send my kids to private school, so it's well spent. So you can certainly do that. I think there's like kind of legislative campaigns to oppose some of these things that Dina pointed out. That House, the congressional bill was passed in the House by 300. It got 301 votes. So that includes a bunch of Democrats. So you can kind of get involved in sort of opposing those things. Support a ceasefire resolution locally within the city of LA, for instance. There's lots of kind of local work that we just described that folks can kind of get in support of. I think the other thing is, to the extent that you all are like university alums of some of these places, like I think alumni have actually played a really important role in kind of condemning some of what universities have been doing, and I would urge folks to be connected to or to reach out to others who you graduated with and see what kind of organizing is happening among alumni to provide support to students. I just saw a list actually. This. A massive list of statements from all kinds of different organizations, alumni groups, departments, all in support of students and opposing the universities, the UCs in particular, kind of repression of student speech. So that those three things, supporting organizations like ours, connect and impact, connecting with these orgs and sort of following their lead in terms of what the sort of action alerts that are coming out of these organizations. That's number one. To connect with alumni groups. If you're if you're an alumnus of any of these affected institutions, connect with the other alumni and see what you can do vis-a-vis that. And then third, reach out to your local electeds and say that what's happening in terms of all of these sort of bad bills is something that you don't support as a constituent.
By the way, one of the bad bills, I think Senator J.D. Vance is opposed to the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism legislation. We'll see how long that lasts now that he's running for vice president. And I'm not telling you to support Trump, please. So don't get me wrong, that's not the point. But it's interesting that in the Senate, there's more opposition to this conflation than there is in the House. And definitely I agree, with Mohammed, let's keep it going in terms of, and it works. When you call your member of Congress, call your U.S. Senator and tell them you're opposed to this because it violates the First Amendment and it's shredding the Constitution. They do listen. It is heard. It's just that the other side, they have a money machine that keeps generating this artificial voice. But when we call, it makes a big difference. We puncture that balloon of artificial messaging from their side.
I just want to add something important. So everything Mohammed said, yes, please do all that. But one thing that I want to add is one way to protect your own constitutional freedoms is to just educate yourself on what those are, especially in the context of free speech. Because I cannot tell you how many people come to me who say, I said what I said because I have the right to freely speak my mind in my workplace, for example. And I have to break to them the very devastating news that we all need to be aware that these constitutional freedoms don't apply in every setting. So we need to be more sophisticated in our understanding of what applies. So for example, in private employment settings, you actually don't have First Amendment rights to speak freely. A lot of people are shocked by that. And I can tell you that because we provide direct legal services, I've had to deal with so many Muslims that have come to me, Palestinians, Arabs, Jewish people, anti-genocide activists that are actually losing their jobs and being terminated because they spoke too openly about their support for Palestine. So I want you all just to also educate yourselves and be aware about where free speech rights apply, primarily, in public spaces, government entities. Even there can be restrictions. And don't wait until you have suffered harm to seek legal advice. That's another thing. So if you are facing a situation where your rights are potentially going to be violated, you're an employee and you're sensing that you may be terminated, or you just want to understand what your rights are, please reach out to one of our organizations, reach out to CAIR, reach out to the ACLU, reach out to any other organization that does this kind of work to understand a little bit more so that we are smarter in how we approach things, because there's a game that's being played, and it's at least important at a minimum that we know what those rules are.
Well, thank you to both for very informative and really a lot of great work that you both outlined. So let's thank our two panelists for giving us their time.